When my daughter Sharia was about 4 years old, 3 or 4 years old, I remember what, I think 4, we had Susie's best friend from Wichita came with her 2 perfectly mannered children. And she had just been through a horrible divorce, but she brought her kids, and her kids were just marvelous. And so we decided we would take everybody to Cloudcroft. And that meant we had to get Shreya, our oldest daughter, into a car seat. And she...
I remember her.
Wow, do you really? I mean, it's funny because people who remember Shreya remember go, wow, that kid's got lungs. And she decided she was not going to put up with a car seat, and so she started throwing a fit. And so here we are with these 2 perfect children of my wife's best friend from college, and our daughter who was just really going bonkers. And so we eventually said, we can't do this, we've got to get this under control. So we took her out of the car seat, we took her into the house, and they all sat on the tailgate of my truck waiting for us, okay? Took her inside the house, put her on my bed, and I'm trying to explain to her she was going to have to do what we said, and boy, she just was so willful. And so I sat her on the bed and I began talking to her. So she started to crawl back down. So I sat her on the bed again. She was fussing and crying, snot coming out of her nose, and her tears and just big screaming, crying. It was so embarrassing. I couldn't believe it. And she's crawling off the bed again. So I took her out, put her on the bed again. And, my constant phrase to her was, "Who is the boss?" And I wanted her to say, "You're the boss." But at that point, I wasn't the boss. So it finally, I got up on the bed because she kept insisting that she was going to crawl down. And I, kind of like dog training, you ever done dog training? Put her on the bed. I got on top of her and said, "You're going to stay right here until I say you can move." And boy, she just went, 45 minutes later, she's still going, crying, and I'm just going to stay there until it's very apparent what's going to happen. Finally, she starts drying up, and she realizes, I guess, that this is only going to go one way. And finally, she starts calming down. I kind of back up, and I say, "Okay, who's the boss?" "You're the boss, Dad!" And I will tell you that from my perspective as a father, that moment changed everything for my daughter. It may be too much to say, but that was a defining moment in our relationship. That she recognized that I was going to insist that she submit, and that I would be there as long as it took for her to submit, and that I was going to do it in love, but my love was hard, and my love was going to be steadfast, which meant I would not cave. She would cave, because it's my firm conviction that my daughter needed to understand who the boss was before she could ever be happy. Well, the book of Ezekiel is God showing the Jews, but showing you and I who the boss is. And it's really, truly some of the most poignant love that you will ever see in the hardest of circumstances and in the hardest of punishments, that these people will recognize God for who He is, because He is insisting in the book of Ezekiel that these people learn the way of love. Okay? So, folks, the primary word of the book of Ezekiel, I want you to understand, is the word move. And it is a word that will begin the book, and it is a word that will end the book. And it is a word that makes a difference all the way through. And it's predominantly God moving. God moving down, God moving forward, you being never lost in all that movement, you being always home in all that movement. So I want you to remember that, because we're going to cover all that today, but we're going to cover it almost every week. God moves down, forward, across. You are never lost. You will always be home. And that is God's promise to you. Okay? All right. Now to get there, so it becomes apparent what we're talking about, so that we cover the book of Ezekiel, I want to go over how contextually the book of Ezekiel is in the Bible. Where it is, why it is. Okay? Now, the book of Ezekiel covers a very small amount of time. Basically 20 years, right here. It is written by a man who is a priest, who begins writing it on his 30th, not on his 30th birthday, but the year of his 30th, when he's 30 years old, which would be the year that a priest would begin serving in the temple. And he writes the very last words of it when he is 50 years old, 20 years into his priesthood, which would be the time when a priest would cease working in the temple, cease serving in the temple. And those 20 years, and in those 20 years, God brings forth amazing messages. But this man, whose very purpose is to serve in the temple in Jerusalem, is never able to. Where he serves is greater. And that's the point for you. You probably have a perception and a conception about where you should serve. You may believe that you're built for it. You're genetically made to serve in a particular place. And what God is going to tell you is, because of your sin, He's going to give you a better place to serve in. Now you're going to look at that and you're going to say, well, that doesn't make sense, Joel. And what I'm going to tell you is that you God lovers here have a blessed promise. You God lovers can know a greater glory, not in spite of your sin, but through your sin, because you remain God lovers. Okay? Believe me, we'll get there. Before we do, let's move back historically so you understand where we are. Saul, David, and then David's son Solomon. You remember that period of time? It's a period of time where really the kingdom of Israel is at its absolute height. It's what one would consider its apex. So at 1050 BC, Saul takes over from a great long period of judges, Samuel the prophet being the last judge of Israel. But you remember all the judges that came before him, like Samson, Samson and Deborah and all of those. Ehud, all those folks, right? Okay. Then God allows the children of Israel to have a king in Saul. He deposes himself, that king, and sets in place David, who ends up being a man after God's own heart. And do you remember what David wanted almost more than anything else to do? Build a temple, but God would not allow it, right? So David began gathering all the stuff to permit his son Solomon to build the temple. And so Solomon built the temple there, and that temple is the primary backdrop, or the primary tool that God uses to convey the message of Ezekiel. Here's some things that God says about that temple. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord, and the priests could not perform their services because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, "The Lord has said he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place to dwell forever. So, what does it sound like God intends with the temple?
Stay there forever.
It's going to be his house, right? He's going to dwell there forever. That's every Jew's concept. And the way he showed it to those people was something happened in the temple when Solomon dedicated it. What happened?
Cloud.
A great cloud came. Do you remember how great that cloud was? Do you remember what happened?
It filled the temple, didn't it?
It did. So let's talk about what the temple looks like. First of all, in the center of the temple, in the very middle of the temple, is what?
Holy place.
There are two basic rooms. A holy place and a holy of holies, separated by what?
Curtain.
A curtain or a veil. We all kind of know that because we understand what happens when Jesus died. That's important, guys, because the last 8 chapters of Ezekiel are about a new temple and the differences between this temple that Solomon built and the temple that Ezekiel starts talking about are going to be poignant differences for you to understand the message of Ezekiel. Okay? When the Shekinah glory of God filled the temple, it was so overpowering, so overwhelming. It's not a fog, folks. It would be, think of lightning. Think of bolts of lightning. Think of energy that's boundless. Think about it billowing. Think about it being fearful and scary. People scattered when the Shekinah glory filled this temple. I mean, do you remember what happened when people would touch, if somebody were to touch the mountain when Moses went up on top and that huge billowing cloud was up there and they touched the mountain, what would happen?
It died.
It would die. But God is a consuming fire. He has always been known as that. So their perception, everybody who lived during this United period, was that in that place dwelt that being forever. Sing praises to the Lord, says the psalmist, enthroned in Zion. Inside the Holy of Holies stood a piece of furniture. Do you remember what that piece of furniture was? The Ark of the Covenant. On the top of the Ark of the Covenant, laying over the top of the Ark of the Covenant is what?
Mercy seat.
The mercy seat. Sitting on each side of the mercy seat are what? Cherubim. Angels depicted in gold, right? Facing each other, wings touching. Remember? Okay. What is that thing besides the Ark of the Covenant?
Presence of God.
It's the seat. It's the throne of God. Underneath the mercy seat would be what? Inside the Ark of the Covenant.
Tablet
Commandments and Aaron's rod.
and a rod.
Right. Aaron's rod that budded, which will be a symbol of resurrection. Life and fruitfulness coming from death. Because we're going to talk a lot about resurrection at the end of this. And over the top of those 10 commandments that nobody could keep would be this seat called the mercy seat, covering over. Because you and I can't fulfill those. And so the mercy seat is what we have to look for. It's what God sits upon, both justice and mercy. So, these people believe that God is enthroned. So God says to Solomon, I have chosen and consecrated this temple so that my name may be there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. 2 Chronicles 7:16. And then in 2 Chronicles 4:18, I will establish your royal throne. Now, he's talking to David here. I will establish your royal throne as I covenanted with David your father. I'm sorry, he's talking to Solomon. When I said, you shall never fail to have a man, and in practice I want you to know that's a son, to rule over Israel. That's 2 Chronicles, I think that's 4, but it could be 7:18. All right, 2 promises then. God is going to rule in Jerusalem, in the temple, seemingly in the Holy of Holies, seemingly from the middle of those archangels, right? And David would always have a man on his throne. So if you're a Jew, you sort of believe those are givens that will never change. Now, something happens after Solomon, and people in Israel don't get along. Two rulers come along, one Solomon's son, the other a man named Jeroboam, and they get really crossways, and there is a civil war, which only lasts a very short period of time because God stops it. And when he stops it, he says, I have sanctioned this kingdom to divide. And 10 of the 12 tribes, form a kingdom in the northern part. And I'm going to go over here now. This right here is the country of Israel. 10 tribes just above the capital city of Jerusalem form what's called Israel. 2 tribes, including Jerusalem down below, form what's called Judah. Israel and Judah. So, we're not even close to Ezekiel yet, but if you don't understand this context, you're not going to understand what's happening in Ezekiel. So, kings come and kings go. At some place just after, between about 800 and 750 BC, a great kingdom arises named Assyria. And you have probably heard about Assyria because at about the same time this great country is arising, its capital city gets attention from God. God says, I need you to go and talk to those Assyrians in the capital city of Nineveh. And do you remember who he sent? Jonah. The whole story of Jonah comes about right about the beginning of this period of Assyrian rule. Now, when I say Assyrian rule, I'm saying Assyria was basically the world kingdom for all the known world at that period of time. It was running all over everybody, and including, it was beginning to make noises about coming after Israel and coming after Judah. So, at about the time that we're just a few years after Jonah, probably about 100 years or 75 years after Jonah comes about, the Assyrians come along and they besiege Samaria and they besiege all of Israel and they destroy it and they take all of the people and they take them away and they scatter them in all the nations, and Israel no longer exists. They take people from other places who don't love Yahweh, who don't love our God, and they sow them into the places of Israel. So that Israel will never be a nation again. And Israel ceased to exist. The 10 tribes of Israel vanished from the face of the earth. They vanished because they were scattered among all the other nations that Assyria had taken over. Now, it became very scary. It became very scary because Judah was still in existence and through its chief city, Jerusalem, was really at risk. At about that time, there is a prophet in Judah, and that prophet is named Isaiah. Isaiah is a marvelous prophet. He writes a book of the Old Testament, and he is predominantly in power when a king named Hezekiah is in place in Judah, and Hezekiah is faithful. Hezekiah is not perfect, but Hezekiah is faithful. Isaiah is a wonderful man. I've got Billy Graham's picture up here because I wanted you to get an idea. Isaiah is basically the crown poet and the chief prophet of Judah. So think about a man who has both political and great religious respect of all the people in America. And the only person I could think of who basically had the ability to respectfully walk with kings or with presidents of the United States, and who could basically had almost nothing you could say against him. The only guy I could really think of was Billy Graham. But Isaiah was asked to do some amazing things so that he could convey to the people that they needed to follow God's word and not their own fears. At one point, because the kingdom of Assyria was pounding down so hard, the Judeans, the people in the countryside, wanted them to go to Egypt and ally themselves with Egypt to keep them safe. And God told Isaiah, take off all your clothes and walk in the palace for 3 years naked. Think about Billy Graham doing that. It's probably a vision you don't even want in your mind. But the point is, God told Isaiah to tell them, if you rely on the Egyptians to save you, you will look like Isaiah. You will be marched off naked. God goes to extremes to communicate to you what he wants you to understand. He will not send a message to you that you cannot grasp. He will send his message to you through people, through events, through poems, through songs, through skits, through allegories. He will use every means known to communicate to you, so you'll get the message. And he does it in the book of Ezekiel. In the book of Ezekiel covers almost every conceivable genre that there is. He speaks to the people in visions. He speaks to the people through prophecy, which is foretelling the future and teaching. He speaks to them through great amounts of symbols. He speaks to them through things called allegories. We'll go through what an allegory means, but you've probably heard of the Pilgrim's Progress, which is an allegory about Christianity. He speaks to them through poetry. He speaks to them through apocalyptic, which is another genre, like the book of Revelation is apocalyptic. He uses all those genres to try to communicate to people so he can change them. When I was talking to my mom and dad yesterday, and I happened to remember as I was talking to my dad about a time when I was about 5 years old. We had just moved to Estancia. And Estancia is a tiny little place, 650 people, with a tiny little church. And when you came out of the church, the street was about, 6-8 feet from the front steps of the church. Tiny little street. I mean, I don't think any street in Estancia was even paved at that point. But I remember coming out of, after church was over, tearing down those steps with my friend Quentin Brown, who was 4, and tearing across that street. And all I remember is just this screech and the stop of a car and looking in the headlights about like that. And I remember, I was telling my dad, because I remember, the only other thing I remember is, I remember my dad's head, about that big, when he came and pulled me out of the road with Quentin, sat me down, and I don't remember what he said, but I remember this big head, that close to me, and I remember thinking, I'll never run in the street again. I'll never run the street again. And I don't remember that he was mad. What I remember was he was scared. See, my dad was scared. And he was going to do everything and in every way he could possibly do it to communicate to me what I had to do to live a long and happy life. God is scared for his remnant. And he's going to use every means possible to communicate to them that they have got to make some changes. They've got to learn some things or they're going to die. So I want you to understand, when you see the book of Ezekiel with all the different things that are being taught there, you say to yourself, I serve a God who loves me enough to reveal himself in dozens of different ways to make sure I get the message, because he will not leave me alone. He wants me to get it. Yeah, Kay.
So is this really the crunch of free will? If anybody doubts that we have it, God will do anything in this world and beyond this world to get us to a certain point. but he will not do inside our being the work that we need to do.
Well, I'm going to just say it this way, okay? I don't believe that that's necessarily true, but what I do believe is I do believe in free will. I believe this. In Revelations 3, Jesus says, I stand at the door and I knock. The reason why he's standing at the door and knocking is because he will not force himself into your heart. You must invite him in. But if you invite him in, he will do the work inside to make your house ready. But you've got to invite him in.
Okay, I don't want to belabor this because I don't want to be on tape, but...
You are already on tape, Kay, sorry.
Okay, so is the invitation the free will?
The free will is the free will. It is the fact that God will not force his
We've
way.
invited him in. Is that the free will?
Yes.
Okay.
It is the fact that there is an invitation.
Okay.
The fact that he waits for an invitation. Now, we're going to go over this. The book of Ezekiel is one of the first books in the Old Testament, folks, to make clear this message. That every man will die for his own sin, not for the sins of his father. The illustration that's given in Ezekiel 18 is that it used to be said that when the father chomped down on the sour grapes, the child would cringe. The idea was that the father did the crazy act, but the son had to taste the bad taste. Ezekiel said that's not the way God works. That's one of the first times you're going to actually see that truth poignantly presented, is in the book of Ezekiel. Isaiah began prophesying, and he told Hezekiah that even though Assyria had captured every other nation on the face of the earth, it would not capture, and had destroyed all of Israel, it would not capture and destroy Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was to believe that. And Isaiah said, I want you to understand this, and he's speaking for God. Surely as I have planned, says God, so it will be. And as I have purposed, so it will stand. A point for you to understand is that what happens is God's plan. It is God's plan. This is the plan determined for the whole world. Understand this as well. There is no kingdom on the face of the earth. There is no power that can do something besides what God dictates. It's important we get to Ezekiel because there's another kingdom coming. And that other kingdom is more powerful than Assyria, so powerful that it defeats Assyria. And God is going to tell Ezekiel, don't worry about how powerful that kingdom is. I control that kingdom. This is the hand stretched out over all nations, for the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? His hand is stretched out, and who can turn it back? So, Hezekiah went to the temple of the Lord, and he prayed, O Lord God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. Got that? Because he figures that that's the whole reason why they're going to be blessed, is because there's a God in Jerusalem who's enthroned between the cherubim. You alone are God over all the kings of the earth. Deliver us. Because the belief is that God's going to deliver him because God's kingdom is there. It's his place. It's his throne. Jerusalem, the temple, Ra. For out of Jerusalem will come a remnant. And that's something that Ezekiel didn't get. Even, let's see, that's going to be almost 100 years later. 100 years later. Ezekiel still hadn't gotten this point. Even though it's prophesied in about 701 BC. Out of Jerusalem will come a remnant, and out of Mount Zion a band of survivors. He will not enter their city or shoot an arrow here. And in fact, on the night that Sennacherib went against Jerusalem, back during Isaiah's time, not a single person went out and fought him. During the middle of the night, God sent an angel, and 180,000, this is fairly well documented, even in secular records, 180,000 Assyrian soldiers died. Sennacherib took his army and went back, and was shortly after that assassinated by his sons. Your God is in control of all nations. And that's the backdrop within which you have to understand the story of Ezekiel. There's something else, though. At that very same time, So 100 years before Ezekiel was born, Isaiah begins prophesying. And he says, at some point in the future, you people who are left are going to get sucked up, taken to Babylon, set down in Babylon. You're going to live there for a period of time. And then a man whose name is Cyrus is going to deliver you and send you back. That's in 700 BC. That doesn't happen until about 530 BC, 170 years later. And the problem for all those people is probably multiple. When they're sitting there with Isaiah and they're hearing this, they're probably going, what? First of all, what's Babylon? I know the city of Babylon, but it's a little upstart place that doesn't have any control, because Assyria's in control of everything. Number two, Cyrus is not a Babylonian name. Number three, why would we be in Babylon? We're Judean. We're the people from Judah. And we are in the forever temple of God. And what ends up happening is, at the end of this time here, the 70-year period here, a man named Cyrus, who is a Persian, not a Babylonian, is in charge of all the world's kingdoms, because he's the big man on the block there, and he releases them to go back. And so what Isaiah prophesied in 700 BC comes about in 530 BC at the end of this period right here. So you should know this. This is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all nations, for the Lord Almighty has purposed. Never believe in anything you do that God does not have a reason for doing it, and that He will not make sure that He guides it for you. You are within His plan. You are not going to be accidentally left behind. God is forming history for you, to change you, to the point where He can move kings, world kings, to do what He needs to do. All right, so 185,000 Assyrians die, and the world progresses. And a prophet named Nahum comes along and explains exactly how the kingdom of Nineveh, how the town of Nineveh is going to fall in about 100 years. And a guy named Jeremiah in 626 BC starts prophesying, and he prophesies for about 15 or 16 years, and about 15 or 16 years after he starts, a really, really powerful king comes along in Babylon by the name of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar gets into a fight with the Assyrians. Of course, it's going to happen, and the Egyptians at a town called Carchemish, and he destroys them all, and nobody saw it coming. However, God always knew it was going to come, because He said that the children of Israel were going to end up in Babylon. So in 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar comes along, and he destroys the town of Jerusalem a little bit. And he takes a few people away from Jerusalem, and he moves them into Babylon, and he sets his own king in place in Jerusalem. Now, do you remember some of the people that he took with him the very first time Nebuchadnezzar captured the city of Jerusalem? 4 young men, very important in the Bible, are taken from Jerusalem over to Babylon, along with hundreds and hundreds of other smart young men. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego. All those stories in Daniel, folks, start right here. 605 BC. In the first destruction of Jerusalem and the first deportation from Jerusalem, he takes away a guy who later becomes what they call a magi, Daniel. When else do you remember hearing about a magi? from Babylon.
The birth of Jesus.
Yeah. In fact, there's a lot of belief that there's some coincidence and some understanding because Daniel actually prophesies as a magi that there's going to be a period of 70 sevens. I'm not going to get into that. But he basically predicts the birth of Jesus 550 years before Jesus is born. So, the people of Israel begin a period of Babylonian captivity and a period where Babylon is the ruler of the earth. And that period lasts for 70 years. And we're going to talk about it next week or the week after, that when it starts, the people of Israel know exactly how long it's going to last. Because Jeremiah told them at the very start, you're going to be here for 70 years. Until the period, frankly, of all the Sabbaths that you have not kept have been fulfilled. 70 years. If they had only heard that God's in control here, if they'd only remembered that they could even know the very name of the person who's going to release them 70 years after they started, if they just believe Jeremiah when he said, in 70 years I will see that you are returned. But if you're a captive in Jerusalem, you're probably thinking about one thing. There's a famous song, by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. Remember that song? By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down. It's a very famous song several years ago. So these people, they lapsed into despair. Instead of remembering the heritage that God had been trying to tell them for all those years, I am in control. What you see as going backwards with me is not backwards. I'm in control. So, from 605 to 597, a puppet vassal king is in control of Jerusalem. He gets haughty and proud and decides that he doesn't want to pay tribute to Nebuchadnezzar anymore, so he rebels, and Nebuchadnezzar sends another group of soldiers over, and they sack Jerusalem again. In 597, the second sacking of Jerusalem takes place, and at that point, 10,000 Judeans are pulled from Jerusalem, and they're moved to Babylon to join people like Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel. They get there. In their midst is a 25-year-old priest named Ezekiel. Well, he's not a priest yet, because he doesn't get to be a priest until he's 30. But a 25-year-old future priest by the name of Ezekiel is taken over there. And he sits dormant in Ezekiel for 5 years, just like everybody else, thinking that his life is over. Thinking that his future is what the Assyrians did to the children of Israel. That he was done. And that's 5 years after that, basically, when he would have started his time in the temple, the book of Ezekiel starts. Okay? Any questions? I want you to know a couple things, okay? The book of Ezekiel is built like a piece of paper that folds in the middle. And if you take the piece of paper and you put a line down the center, in the very center is the pivotal chapter of the book of Ezekiel. On each side of the fold, though, are mirror images of one another. So, on this side, chapter 24, is the pivotal event of Ezekiel. And it happens to be the third sacking of Jerusalem and the total destruction of the temple and the city walls. When the temple is utterly and completely destroyed and burned, and all the stones are just toppled one from the other. That is the pivotal moment of the book of Ezekiel. The first 23 chapters are trying to explain to you how God is revealed in the fall of Jerusalem. Most of us would see only God's judgment in the fall of Jerusalem. God is trying to explain to you His mercy and His plan in the fall. The last 24 chapters, except for this one little section here that we're not even going to cover, where God talks about other nations, and letting you know that He's not just concerned about those two little tribes of Judah who happen to have survived but are now in Babylon. He wants you to know that through the restoration of Israel, or spiritual Israel, He's letting you know who He is as well. So, chapter 1, the theme of chapter 1 is God is here. The theme of chapter 48 is basically God is here. It's also said God is there. So if you take the book, fold it just like that, chapter 1 and chapter 48 are going to match. If you go to chapter 3, you're going to see about Ezekiel being the watchman of divine judgment. But if you go over here to chapter 33, on the other side, it's Ezekiel as the watchman of the new age. If you come over here in chapter 6, the mountains are going to be rebuked. But if you come over here to chapter 36, the mountains are going to be consoled. And you have to understand that the mountains have great symbolism, because that's one of the ways that God is trying to communicate to them. If you look over here in chapters 8 through 10, and we'll cover that a tiny bit today, you're going to see a vision of the glory of the Lord. Now, what does the glory of the Lord look like when it's in the temple? Big clouds, Shekinah glory. It's going to lift and depart from Jerusalem. In chapters 40 through 48, you're going to see the glory of the Lord descending back into the temple. So this big book has a big message that you have to look at from start to finish to understand that God is trying to get a really particular message through to you. So, what I'd like to do is I'd like to start in chapter 1 and see if we can't start understanding that message just a little bit. Now, I told you that the word moves is huge in the book of Ezekiel. And it begins here in chapter 1. So, let's begin reading. In the 30th year, so in his 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kibar River, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel, the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kibar River, in the land of the Babylonians. All right. That last part, folks, is really, really vital. In the land of the Babylonians. Why?
Because they're not in Judah.
You're right. They're not in Judah. They're not in Jerusalem. They're not in the temple. They're not in the holy place. They're not in the Holy of Holies. They're in Babylon. And why are they there?
They were forced to go there.
Why were they forced to go there? Were they forced to go there because a powerful nation came and took them?
God.
God. You see, this is the plan determined for the whole world. This is the hand stretched out over all nations. For the Lord Almighty has purposed, and who can thwart him? God has taken them to Babylon. Because they needed it, because they were sinful. Because they were sinful people who had left him and had disobeyed him, and he took them there. But it's very important to understand that what's happening in chapter 1 happens in Babylon. So there the hand of the Lord was upon him. Verse 4. I looked and I saw a windstorm. All right. Why is the word windstorm significant? Does anybody know? The book of Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and substance. It was void, right? And the Spirit of the Lord, what? Moved over the face of the waters. And movement is always God's byword. And then when he destroyed the earth by water, and after the water had destroyed the earth, and God had brought forth Noah and all the people, he sent the wind to do what? To dry up the water so that creation could begin yet again. And the word for wind is what? It's a word in Hebrew that has two meanings. It's the word ruach. It means wind. It also means spirit. So you've got a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. Wow, what does that sound like? The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was that of a man, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight, their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Under their wings on their 4 sides, they had the hands of a man. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and their wings touched one another. What does that sound like? Yeah, like the Ark of the Covenant, huh? Each one went straight ahead. They did not turn as they moved. So somebody, tell me what you think. Well, keep reading, and then you can tell me what you think you're seeing. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a man, and on the right side, each had the face of a lion, and on the left, the face of an ox. Each also had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out upward. They had 2 wings, one touching the wing of another creature on either side, and 2 wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. There was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like chrysolite, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel, intersecting a wheel. As they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not turn about as the creatures went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels beside them moved. And when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Stop there. What are you seeing? Describe what you're seeing. It's crazy, huh?
Confusion. I mean,
I've been
when you
scared.
read it, trying to imagine it, it's like, no.
Okay, so let's just start. All right, so how many creatures are there? 4. Give me some of the, what do their faces look like?
4 faces.
4 faces. Do you kind of get the idea? They're facing in 4 different directions, sort of?
Yeah.
And what are their 4 faces?
Lion,
Lion, eagle,
man,
man,
ox.
ox. Okay, and they have wings, right? And they look like, what do they look like? Give me some characteristics of them.
they glow, fire,
Yeah,
thunder, lightning.
yeah, yeah. They're very scary, and they've got something like a wheel What does the wheel look like?
Eyes all the way around.
Eyes all around it. What else?
It was shiny, it was sparkling.
Okay, the rims. What do the rims look like? Do they look like a wheel in your car? Roger?
No, much bigger.
Bigger? They're awesome?
It's more like a sphere, so it can roll in any direction.
Yes. It's a wheel in a wheel. So think about a wheel going this way, and a wheel going this way, a wheel going this way, a wheel going this way, so that the wheel never has to turn, does it? The creature never turns. Okay, so let's keep reading. When the living creatures moved, verse 19, the wheel beside them moved, and when the living creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, and the wheels would rise along with him, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When the creatures moved, they also moved. When the creatures stood still, they also stood still. And when the creatures rose from the ground, the wheels also rose with them, because the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Those are some pretty awesome wheels. Okay, let's keep going. Spread out above the heads of the living creatures. So, where are we looking now? Above their heads was what looked like an expanse, sparkling like ice and awesome. Under the expanse, their wings were stretched out one toward the other, and each had 2 wings covering its body. When the creatures moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the roar of rushing waters, like the voice of the Almighty, like the tumult of an army. When they stood still, they lowered their wings. Then there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads as they stood with lowered wings. Above the expanse over their heads was what looked like a throne of sapphire. And high above, on the throne, was a figure like that of a man. All right, so what do you see above these 4 creatures? Throne.
There's a man on the throne.
Something like a man, right? Okay. Now let's describe the man. I saw that from what appeared to be his waist up, he looked like glowing metal, as if full of fire, and that from there down he looked like fire, and brilliant light surrounded him, like the appearance of a rainbow in the clouds on a rainy day. So was his radiance around him. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. What are they seeing, guys?
Jesus.
They're seeing Jesus. They're seeing the pre-incarnate Jesus. And when they're seeing it, they're seeing also the glory of the Lord. What is the glory? What is the Shekinah glory of the Lord?
God's presence.
God's presence. In the manifestation of Jesus on a throne above the cherubim. Do you remember another story about a picture of thrones and cherubim over an expanse of great crystal sea?
Revelation.
Let's go to Revelation 4. Let's go to Revelation 4. I want you to compare this depiction with the one we just read. Chapter 4. This is John. John being caught up into heaven. John the Revelator, who is on the Isle of Patmos. And this comes, guys, this picture comes, let's see, that is going to be 6. Let's see, it's going to be about 592 when this Ezekiel. And so John is writing in about 96 AD, so about 600 years later. Here's John. After this I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven, and the voice I heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this." At once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and carnelian. A rainbow resembling an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. They were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their heads. From the throne came flashes of lightning, rumblings and peals of thunder. Before the throne, 7 lamps were blazing. These are the 7 spirits of God. And before the throne, there was what looked like a sea of glass, clear as crystal. In the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third was had the face of a man, the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings and was covered with eyes all around, even under his wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and who is to come." Whenever the living creatures give glory, honor, and thanks to him who sits on the throne and who lives forever and ever, the 24 elders fall down before him who sits on the throne and worship him who lives forever and ever. They lay their crowns before the throne and say, "You are worthy, our Lord and God, to receive glory and honor and power, for you created all things, and by your will they were created and have their being." Right now, there's a few differences, aren't there? But think about this. You've got 2 people trying to describe what is absolutely impossible for the human eye to describe. So one saw 4 creatures with 4 faces. One saw 4 creatures with a face just like the same faces that they saw. Who knows what John saw and Ezekiel saw? But there is one very distinct difference between the Revelation passage and the Ezekiel passage. Do you know what it is? What do you not see in Revelation?
Thunder and lightning.
You see thunder and lightning in both.
Whales.
Wheels. What's the deal with the wheels? Okay. You are a Jew, all right? You're a Jew. You have been yanked from your home. You think never to return. You are there because you know you have lived a sinful life and your country has lived a sinful life. And you have been set down in Babylon, a country far, far away. 2 New Mexico widths. 2 New Mexico widths from where you come from. So go twice, and you're there. And you probably are in despair, and you know that you are there because of the consequence of yours and your brother's sin. That's who you are. And that's what your life is, and that's what your hope is. Suddenly, down from heaven comes the glory of the Lord that you believe resides in Jerusalem, in the temple. And it has this appearance. And I will tell you folks, in this period of time, in this very small period right here, there are more appearances of the glory of the Lord and of this great molten iron man that you see than almost anywhere else, because he appears in the book of Daniel, and he appears in the book of Ezekiel, and he's referred to in the book of Jeremiah, which is all taking place at the very same time, and almost all of other Bible history combined. Why does God appear to them in Babylon?
So they know he's still with them.
Yes. You know, I think in my life, I have found myself in circumstances where I felt like the consequences of my sin disqualified me from being able to rely on the presence of God. And what the book of Ezekiel tells me is that my God has wheels. He is not someone that I will go to in Jerusalem because I'm captivated by my sin. I am held captive by my sin. And my God is coming to me in my place of sin, in the consequences of my sin. And he is coming to me. And the wheels, folks, are an indication that my God moves himself from where I perceive him to be sitting to right on top of me even though I'm in Babylon and I deserve to be there. And my God is not abandoning me, even though I'm where I am, because I'm a sinful man.
Not only that, he's moved you there.
He did. He moved me there for a purpose, and that's what we're going to have to talk about in the next few lessons. Another thing you need to understand is that those wheels, they indicate that God moves. His throne is not something for me to achieve and go to. His throne comes to me. There are the best definition of religion, folks, I know of is this. Anything that requires me to stack my righteous deeds up and climb my way up to God is false religion. Anything that depicts a God who comes down to me and finds me on my knees in absolute and utter despair is true religion. True religion is always God moving down, coming to me. And that is Jesus. And that is the first chapter of Ezekiel. Because God is coming down. And he is coming down with his very throne that is transportable to you. And which direction does God's throne always travel? Does he ever go backwards?
It's always forward.
He always is moving forward. In your life, I will bet there have been circumstances in your life where you felt like, I have taken a terrible step backward. I don't know if I can recover from this step backwards. And you need to believe this, that as long as God is by your side, every step is forward. It does not matter where you are. You believe that you're in Babylon because of your sin, and you are. But do not believe that God cannot and has not planned to take you there to move you forward. He has a purpose for you. And do not believe that he is not powerful enough to always move you forward. God moves down. God moves forward. God moves across. There isn't a national boundary that he will not move across. There is not a sin stronghold that can keep him out from you. There is not a relational boundary that can keep you from God. There is not a rule that can keep you from God. He crosses all boundaries. He is international to the point where he will come into your heart. In the sovereign nation of your heart, if you'll invite him in, he is absolutely able to move across. The final thing I want you to understand is that you are never lost. There is one psalm in the Bible which was written by Moses, Psalm 90. I'd like you to turn to Psalm 90. Now, when you think of Moses and the children of Israel, where do you think of their home being?
The desert.
All over the desert, right? Just from Egypt to the edge of Jerusalem, back all through the desert. But I want you to see where Moses thinks home is. Psalm 90. Can somebody start reading that? I'll stop you.
Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were born, where you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting.
Okay. Where was their dwelling place?
In the Lord.
If you're an Israelite in Babylonian captivity, and you are far from what you perceive to be your home, and you recognize this one great truth, that the Lord is your home, that as long as you are beside the Lord, you are home, then you have, at that very moment, ceased captivity. When what you want more than anything in the world is to be dwelling in Him, and wherever you sit does not matter, you are free. So go to Ezekiel 11. One of the first lessons that God is trying to teach them is this concept. God has moved down, we've seen that. God has moved forward always. God has moved across. And you are never alone, and you are always home. In chapter 11, after we have, I'm going to tell you that in chapters 8 through 10, we're going to see the glory of the Lord depart from Israel. And all the people in Ezekiel's day are going to lose all hope. In chapter 11, God tries to explain to them this concept. He says, verse 16, therefore say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Although I sent them far away among the nations and scattered them among the countries, yet for a little while I have been a sanctuary for them in the countries where they have gone. That's what God wants for you too. He wants you to be at home, resting, faithful and safe in Him, no matter where you are, no matter where you've been carried, no matter the fact that it wasn't by your will. And it may be cancer that carries you there. It may be the loss of somebody dear to you that carries you there. It may be your own sin that carries you there. But your God does not ever want you to believe you are abandoned. He wants you for a little while, this little while, to find your sanctuary in Him. And that, folks, is the central theme of the book of Ezekiel. But he's got a lot of messages to teach you, because God is here, and He's going to tell you at the end, God is everywhere. You are never alone, and in fact, it gets better. Right in this period of here, He's going to say, that wind is going to start moving again, and it's going to move right in your heart. And then He's going to really move.